So you're doing your very first design project and your tutor or your professor has asked you for some concept sketches and you're not really sure you know what that is, but they've said just use your imagination, you'll be fine. So let's say the project is something really small like a meditation space on a greenfield site. So you go off and you do exactly what you're asked to do, use your imagination, and you come up with something you think is pretty compelling. And you bring in your drawings on Friday for the review and you put them on the wall, and lo and behold, it turns out you've got the whole thing wrong. The tutor isn't one bit impressed. So where do we go from here? It might be useful to start off by looking at the difference between a common or a basic idea and an architectural concept. Now, a common idea might be something like this. You are asked to design a small building and it has to have an entrance. So you propose that the entrance should be a Greek-style portico because everybody knows that Greek-style porticos are beautiful. How wrong can you be? Well, it turns out your tutor isn't that interested in a Greek-style portico. The better way to go is to propose a concept. Now, a concept is an idea which has some sort of force attached to it, a kind of a weight, so that if you express it correctly on your drawing and I come to the review on Friday, there's every chance that I'm going to understand what it is that you have in mind without you having to be overly explicit about it. So let's have a look at what a few concepts might be. The first one we might look at is the grid. So here's a basic grid. Grids are regular and rational, and they can be 2 or 3 dimensional, and they relate very much to the Cartesian geometry that we studied when we were back in school, so we kind of understand them. Grids have the ability to organize space in our minds. If I draw a very basic tartan grid, we call this a tartan grid, we could decide that these smaller rectangles here, these are the places where I put my services or my less important spaces. And in the larger areas here, the squares and the big rectangles, well, this could be where I'd have living room spaces or library reading rooms or maybe double height spaces. And the way the grid works is once you propose it and put it on the page, something of your organizational principle is transferred to my imagination without you having to draw the entire building. I think it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that grids are quite beautiful things. I think most of us would agree with that. And in some ways we might consider a very simple grid very beautiful precisely because it is simple. The main thing about the grid is that it helps me to view my proposal as somehow systematic. A building can be seen as a system. And for some reason, we seem to appreciate it more if a building has some kind of system to it than if it's just a random collection of spaces all flung together on a corridor. Corbusier used the grid in a more complicated way. We can see that the grid is fairly straightforward in the Villa Savoye, but he's actually using the grid as a foundation upon which to do more complicated things. A variation on this grid idea is the courtyard concept. So if I start off with a very basic 3x3 grid here, well, I could decide that the piece in the middle is actually open to the outside world and it's actually an internal court or a garden. And if I draw it that way, then we can suddenly see that somehow I'm creating architecture. I'm putting architectural ideas into your mind. And then if I just go back and make a little bit of a tartan grid with the rest of the internal space, you can see how I'm suddenly coming up with an architectural plan. Now this arrangement has a multitude of variations that I could come up with. So just because I decide to go with a courtyard concept, that doesn't necessarily mean that the building is already designed. There's still quite a few decisions left for me to make. And there's another little trick that I can use here when I'm using a grid, which is that I can have 2 grids and I can superimpose one grid over another, a little bit like the architect Peter Eisenman has been doing over the past number of years. And you can see that where the 2 grids overlap, there's the possibility of interesting spaces. They suddenly just suggest themselves to me without me having to do anything to create them. And suddenly I'm in the world of creating architectural space. Another concept that we rely on quite a bit when we're starting out in architecture is that of the inhabited wall. Okay, walls are typically made of masonry elements like bricks or blocks, and they're usually about maybe 4 to 6 inches thick, 100 to 150 millimeters thick. But there's another way of thinking about this wall. What if I exaggerate its width and maybe make it 1.5 or 2 meters wide? And then inside the thickness of this large masonry unit, I carve out some spaces for myself, so I could easily put a stairs in here, maybe, or a small bathroom or a kitchenette, that kind of thing. And so what happens here is that the wall becomes an architectural concept. We can do a lot with this. The very choice of the materials that I might use to create this structure, well, that might lead to an architectural concept as well. The brick, for example, has a preferred way of being. The brick likes to be in a wall, and as Louis Kahn mentioned, it likes to be in an arch as well. So if I just choose to make my building out of brick, I'm actually setting an architectural concept in motion already, just by that very act. Timber too has preferred ways in which it likes to be used. So in some ways, when I select timber, it's making some decisions for me that I don't have to make for myself. And some people would say that the same thing happens perhaps with concrete, that it has a preferred way of organizing itself, and once we do that, we're going to end up with something really quite beautiful. When you are asked by your tutor to come up with an architectural concept, it's pretty likely that those topics that we've just been talking about, the grid and its variations, the inhabited wall, the choice of materials, it's pretty likely that that's what your tutor has in mind. They want you to get into this area. Now, there is one other little thing that usually comes along with it. You'll remember that in previous videos we did some site analyses and we looked at how we can get some ideas, architectural ideas, from the nature of the site. Well, usually what your tutor is asking you to do is to bring those ideas that you already generated to do at the site and marry them to some of the ideas we've been talking about, which is to say the grid or the inhabited wall, so that you come up with an approach. With a bit of luck, we now have a handle on an architectural concept. Now, there's one other area that I want to discuss as a possible source of an architectural concept, and that is the use of the section drawing to generate architectural ideas. I'm going to do that in the next video. But in the meantime, next time you're asked by your tutor or your professor for an architectural concept, hopefully you now have an idea about how to go about doing that.